bleeding beneath a broken wagon in the Cutbank Valley dirt. Josiah Reed did not know the cowgirl kneeling over him was about to change his life, or that the last biscuit she pressed into his hands, the only food she had left that week, would end up cracking open a fraud ring big enough to swallow half the valley whole. He was a lawman, though she did not know that yet. She was a woman. The whole valley had already decided no man would ever marry, though he did not know that either. Neither one of them mentioned any of it that first hour. She simply knelt in the road dust beside a stranger who might already be dying, and she went to work saving him, because saving people was the one thing in this world Rowan Keller had never once hesitated to do. I've carried a good many valley stories in my time, some handed down at church suppers, some copied out of yellowed newspaper columns, some passed to me plain by the grandchildren of the folks who lived them, and I will tell you honestly that this is one of the good ones. To understand how a cowgirl running 600 acres alone came to hold the fate of an entire valley in her own two hands, you need her story and you need his, in full, the ranch and the badge, the pride that kept her single and the secret that kept him lying about his own name. Stay with me, for both halves of it. I promise you the ending is worth every mile of road it takes to get there. Rowan Keller had been running Split Rock alone for going on 4 years, ever since a spring fever took her father in 11 hard days and left her at 26, holding 600 acres of Cutbank Valley grass, with nothing standing between her and ruin but a graying hired hand named Amos Whitfield. She would not sell 1 inch of what he had built with his own 2 hands. She could break a green colt in an afternoon without raising her voice above a murmur. She could doctor a snake-bit calf at midnight with a steady hand and no lamp to spare. She kept her own books in her father's old ledger, in her own plain hand, because she had watched too many women in that valley hand their affairs to a husband and lose the affairs, along with the husband, when the marriage went sour or the man simply moved on. She could shoot a rattler off a fence post at 30 yards without spilling the coffee in her other hand, and more than one drover passing through Piney Fork had learned to his considerable surprise not to mistake her plain speech for an invitation to instruct her in anything. It was exactly that capability the valley held against her. Piney Fork liked its women soft-spoken and its ranches run by men, and a woman who could out-rope, out-shoot, and out-argue most of the bachelors in the county had been quietly filed by a town that never held a formal vote on the matter under the heading of unmarriageable brats. 2 suitors had come calling in as many years. The first had wanted the 600 acres considerably more than he had wanted her, and had made that plain within a month, clear enough that she showed him the road the same afternoon. The second had watched her gentle, a wild-eyed stallion at a spring social that no man present could get near, and had announced to 3 of his friends, loud enough for her to hear every word of it, that he did not intend to spend his life married to a woman who made him look small. Rowan had not cried about either of them. She had gone home, fed her stock, and stood a long while by her own fire, certain that a ranch fed honestly was worth considerably more than a husband who needed feeding on his pride, and that a woman who waited for the right kind of partner rather than settling for the first willing one was not lonely so much as patient. What the valley never quite managed to hold against her, because it did not fit the story they preferred to tell about her, was the kindness underneath all that capability. She kept a standing place at her own kitchen table on winter evenings for any of the neighbor children whose folks could not spare the schooling, teaching sums and letters by lamplight long after the one-room schoolhouse in Piney Fork had shut its door for the season. She fed every hungry drifter who knocked at Split Rock without asking what he'd done to end up hungry. She had ridden out twice that spring alone to doctor a neighbor's sick herd for nothing but the promise of help come branding season, because that was simply the accounting Rowan Keller kept in her own head, separate from the ledger, the accounting of what decent people owed each other, paid whether or not it was ever going to be paid back. There was a widow, 2 ranches over, a Mrs. Sorensen, with 3 young children and a husband barely a year in the ground, who woke one November morning to find her whole woodpile split and stacked neat against the barn wall, with no note and no name attached to the work, though the whole valley knew well enough whose horse tracks led away from that yard toward Split Rock. Rowan never once claimed credit for it herself. She simply carried on, quietly certain that the measure of a person was what they did when nobody was keeping count, and Piney Fork, for all its talk about her prospects, had never once found a genuine complaint to lodge against her character. Only against the fact that she did not appear to need anyone the way the valley expected its women to need a husband. Josiah Reed was 34 years old, and he had been a deputy United States Marshal out of the Helena office for 6 of those years, the last 2 of them spent chasing something that did not yet have a proper name on any federal docket, a quiet, patient fraud working its way through the isolated valleys of Montana Territory, in which homesteaders who had filed their claims honestly a decade or more back were being informed, politely and with official-looking paperwork, that a territorial resurvey had turned up a clerical defect in their original filings, and that they would need to sign a modest re-registration fee over to a company named Continental Land and Title before the district office in Fort Benton closed the books on the old claims for good. Josiah had watched that trick work twice already, in valleys 2 counties over, watched families with legitimate deeds hand their land to strangers out of nothing but fear and unfamiliarity with their own paperwork, and both times he had arrived after the fact, when there was nothing left to do but write down what had already been lost. He carried, underneath the badge, a harder private weight. A year before, working a smaller swindle outside Bozeman, he had trusted a local widow's account of a land agent's dealings without confirming it independently, had moved on her word alone, and the agent in question had gotten wind of the investigation and disappeared a full week before Josiah's warrant was signed, taking with him the evidence that would have returned 3 homesteads to their rightful owners. He had promised himself since then that he would never again let a stranger's honest face talk him past his own procedure, that the badge required a caution that had nothing to do with whether he liked or trusted the person standing in front of him. It was that same caution traveling into Cutbank Valley, under the borrowed name of Cal Rourke, a drifting drover with no fixed address and no reason for anyone to look at him twice, that had him alone on the Piney Fork road with a busted wagon axle when the whole rig came down wrong on a steep grade, throwing him hard against a jagged plank and pinning his leg beneath the rear wheel in the empty dirt. Rowan found him an hour later, riding fence on the far edge of Split Rock Range, and she did not stop to weigh the wisdom of it. She got the wagon off him with a fence post for a lever and every ounce of strength in her back, dragged him clear, and looked at a shoulder wound gone dark, with dried blood, and a leg bruised badly enough that she could not be sure, without a doctor's eye, whether the bone beneath it had cracked. Split Rock's barn was closer than town by a good 3 miles, and closer still than any doctor, so she got him up onto her own horse behind her, walked the animal the whole slow way home holding the reins herself, and laid him out on clean straw in the barn's back stall. Because the house had only the 1 bed, and she was not about to put a bleeding stranger in it before she knew his name. She threaded her grandmother's old bone needle by lamplight and closed the wound herself, the way her grandmother had taught her before the fever took her too, and when he stirred, half conscious under the needle, she pressed a flat hand to his good shoulder and held him there plain and unhurried. The same steady manner she used on colts that had not yet learned to trust her hands. She had packed almost nothing extra that week. Split Rock's cellar had run thin since the drought cut her hay yield in half that summer, and thinner still since word had gone around that Continental Land and Title was leaning hard on ranchers along the creek to sign their filings over. She had exactly 1 biscuit left from that morning's baking, saved back for her own supper, and when he came around enough to focus his eyes on her face, she pressed it straight into his hand without a second thought, and would not hear a word of protest until he had eaten every crumb of it, because a man who had lost that much blood needed it more than she needed her pride about going hungry one more night. He came around fully near dusk, blinking up at barn rafters and a woman's face he did not recognize, and the first clear thought that crossed his mind before the pain in his shoulder fully announced itself was that he had been careless enough to get himself hurt within a day's ride of the very valley he had come to investigate quietly. He gave his name as Cal Rourke, the way he had given it in 3 towns already that season, easily, without a flicker, and let her believe he had been passing through looking for drover's work when the wagon gave way beneath him. Rowan accepted it the way she accepted most things, a stranger set in front of her, without immediate suspicion, but without setting it in stone either. Filing it away in the same careful spot in her mind where she kept the price of cattle and the coming weather, ready to be revised the moment the facts pointed some other direction. What neither of them yet understood, as the barn settled into that first quiet evening with a stranger heeling in the straw and a woman sitting up late to watch him breathe, was that the deadline already nailed to the Piney Fork Mercantile Board, every homestead along Cutbank Creek to be re-registered with Continental Land and Title by the 1st of October, or forfeited outright to the territory for resale, named her own 600 acres among the parcels in dispute, and that the man she had just saved was the one person in 4 counties who might actually know why. That notice had been hanging on the Mercantile Board for the better part of 3 weeks by then, long enough that most of Cutbank Creek had already read it a dozen times over, and long enough that the fear it planted had started doing its own quiet work in kitchens up and down the valley. 6 families had signed already. 2 more were talking about it openly. At church, weighing the modest fee Continental Land and Title asked, against the alternative of losing everything to a resale they did not understand and could not afford to fight in a territorial courtroom 200 miles away. Rowan had read the notice herself twice, standing in the Mercantile with a sack of flour under one arm, and had felt the same cold drop in her stomach every rancher along that creek was feeling, the particular fear of a person who has worked a piece of ground with her own hands for years, informed in polite official language that none of it might actually belong to her after all. The weeks that followed had a particular careful rhythm to them, the kind 2 people fall into when one is healing and the other has decided, without quite admitting it to herself, that she does not entirely mind the company. Josiah, Cal, as she still knew him, could not do a horseman's work with a stitched shoulder, but he was not built for idleness either, and within a week he had made himself useful mending harness leather and fixing a hinge on the barn door that had been dragging since before her father died. Small, steady labor that demanded nothing of her and gave the ranch back a little of what it had been missing. Amos Whitfield watched the stranger with the flat, patient suspicion of a man who had outlived 2 range wars and did not intend to be caught flat-footed by a third. But even Amos allowed drudgingly over supper one evening that the fellow knew which end of a hammer to hold. Mark Twain is often credited with the observation that the 2 most important days in a person's life are the day they are born and the day they discover why. Neither Rowan Keller nor the man calling himself Cal Rourke knew it yet, sitting across her kitchen table night after night, arguing gently over cattle prices and the fairest way to break a colt, but that second day was already riding toward both of them, and it was going to arrive a good deal sooner than either one expected. Horace Pruitt came to Split Rock on a bright Tuesday morning, dressed too well for a working ranch, with a leather satchel of papers, and a younger man named Vernon Coyle, trailing a half-step behind him carrying a surveyor's chain he never once appeared to use. Pruitt introduced himself as a representative of Continental Land and Title, laid out for Rowan in the smooth, unhurried tone of a man who has given the same speech 40 times, the matter of the territorial resurvey and the clerical irregularity it had turned up in her late father's original filing, and produced a fresh document for her signature that would, he explained, correct the defect and secure her title once and for all for a modest transfer fee payable to his company. Rowan read it twice at her own kitchen table, the way she read every contract twice before she signed anything, and made it plain she would need time to have the matter looked at independently before she put her name to it. Pruitt's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did. He mentioned as he was leaving that the Hargrove family 2 ranches over had already signed, and that a woman running a place alone might find it wiser not to be the last holdout when the office in Fort Benton closed the old books for good. Tao was in the barn when Pruitt's buggy left, and Rowan found him standing very still at the open door, watching it go with an expression she had not seen on him before, sharp and entirely without the easy drover's manner he usually wore. When she pressed him on what was wrong, his answer was only that he had heard of outfits like Continental Land and Title working other valleys, and that she should not sign anything without having it checked by someone who actually knew the district's filing records. It was, she would realize only later, the first entirely honest thing he had confided in her, since she pulled him out from under that wagon, and at the time it simply struck her as a kind thing for a passing drover to bother knowing. It was Amos who first put the doubt in her ear directly. He had ridden into Fort Benton for supplies and come back with talk from the livery of a federal man asking quiet questions about land filings 2 counties back, a man folks described in a way that put Amos uncomfortably in mind of the drover healing in their own barn. Rowan turned that over for 2 full days before she pressed Cal outright. One evening on the porch with the last of the light going long and gold across the range on whether Cal Rourke was in fact his own name at all. He was quiet, long enough that she had her answer before he ever opened his mouth. "No," he finally allowed. "It isn't." She stood up from the porch, step at that, arms folded, and demanded plainly why a man would let a woman stitch his shoulder and eat at her table for weeks under a name that was not his own. He gave her the truth then, all of it, slower than she wanted and more carefully than she needed, that his name was Josiah Reed, that he carried a deputy marshal's badge sewn into the lining of his boot, that he had come into the valley quietly to investigate the very company now standing in her kitchen, and that her own homestead, sitting square in the middle of the disputed parcels along the creek, had made him more cautious about trusting anyone connected to it than he was proud to admit, even a woman who had saved his life with her own 2 hands and her own last biscuit. "You treated me like a suspect," she managed, and there was no heat in it, only the plain naming of the thing, which somehow stung worse than anger would have. He did not argue the point. He laid out Bozeman for her, the widow whose word he had trusted without checking it, and the homesteads it had cost when the swindler slipped free, and confessed that the caution had become a habit. He did not entirely know how to set down even when the person in front of him had never once given him a reason to doubt her. "If you want to stand with this channel, tap the join button beside the channel name, and become a member. Every one of you keeps the fire lit." She did not forgive him standing on that porch, and she made that plain to him besides. But 3 days later, riding out together to check on a line shack at the far edge of Split Rock Range, an early autumn storm rolled down off the mountains fast enough to catch them both a mile from any shelter but the shack itself, and they spent 6 hours waiting it out by a small stove while the rain hammered the roof and the wind worked at the shutters like something with a grudge against the whole valley. Somewhere in those 6 hours, talking first about nothing in particular and then about everything that mattered, the worst of the hurt between them settled into something calmer. Not quite forgiveness yet, but close enough to see it from where they stood. He laid out what the badge had cost him in the years since Bozeman. She laid out in turn what 4 years of being labeled unmarriageable had cost her, and how she had built her own kind of wall, too, one that let good stock and good neighbors in, but never quite let a man close enough to leave a mark. Neither one of them named the word love in that shack. It sat between them anyway. Plain and waiting, the way honest things wait when nobody rushes them. It was Rowan, 3 weeks later, going through her father's original 1866 homestead certificate alongside a copy of Pruitt's supposedly corrected filing that Amos had quietly obtained from a Hargrove cousin willing to talk, who found the thread that would unravel the whole scheme. She had spent enough winters helping half the valley's families read their own land papers by lamplight to know better than most working ranchers in the county exactly what a genuine district filing was supposed to look like. And something about the registration number on Pruitt's corrected document would not sit right in her mind no matter how she turned it. Her father's original certificate carried a 5-digit registration number beginning with a 3, the same pattern she had seen on a dozen neighbors' certificates from that same filing year. Pruitt's replacement document carried a 6-digit number beginning with an 8, a format the Fort Benton District Office had never once used in any paper she had handled from before 1870. It was not a clerical correction at all. It was a forgery, built by men who understood land law well enough to fool a frightened rancher, but not well enough to know that a schoolteacher's daughter who had spent 4 winters reading other people's homestead certificates by her own kitchen lamp would recognize a fake number the instant she saw it sitting next to the real one. She rode straight to the line shack where Josiah had gone to ground since his cover had thinned, laid both documents on a table between them, and set out plainly what her eyes had caught. He studied the numbers for a long, quiet minute, and then he looked up at her with an expression she would remember the rest of her life, something between disbelief and plain gratitude, and confessed that she had just handed him the one piece of proof his investigation had been missing for 2 full years. Pruitt did not go quietly once he understood the ground had shifted under him. Within days, he had Vernon Coyle riding the valley, pressuring the last holdout ranchers to sign before the October deadline closed, leaning hardest on the Sorensen widow and her 3 children, who had no husband left, to stand between them and a stranger's raised voice on their own porch. When word reached him that a federal man had been seen at the Keller place, he sent Coyle to Split Rock at night to frighten rather than persuade, cutting fence wire along the creek pasture and leaving a plainly worded warning nailed to the barn door about women who meddled in men's business. Amos found the cut wire at first light and mended it himself before Rowan was even awake. The same quiet way he had always shouldered whatever needed shouldering on that ranch, and kept it entirely to himself until she noticed a fresh splice herself that afternoon. Josiah could not yet move openly against Pruitt without solid documentation the Helena office would accept, and a single suspicious registration number, however certain Rowan was of it, was not enough on its own to hold up a federal warrant against a company with lawyers in 3 territories. What he needed was a pattern proof that Pruitt's forged numbering ran through every disputed filing in the valley, and not merely her father's, and there was exactly one person positioned to gather that pattern quickly and quietly without spooking Pruitt into running before the marshals from Helena could arrive. Rowan spent the 4 days before the deadline doing exactly that, riding to every ranch along Cutbank Creek that had not yet signed, sitting at kitchen tables with worried neighbors and their own old certificates, matching registration numbers against the pattern she had already proven, and finding the same false 6-digit format on 11 separate parcels. A scheme wide enough and brazen enough that even Amos, who trusted very little, allowed it was the plainest case of theft he had seen in 40 years working that range. The valley gathered at the Piney Fork church on the last evening before the deadline, gathered by a notice Rowan had requested the preacher read from the pulpit 2 Sundays running, and Pruitt came, too, smooth and confident, expecting one more room of frightened homesteaders ready to sign. Rowan stood up before he had finished his opening remarks, walked to the front with her father's original certificate in one hand and the forged replacement in the other, and held the 2 documents up side by side for the whole room to see, reading the registration numbers aloud slowly enough that even the folks in the back pew could follow the mismatch. She named the 11 other parcels she had checked and posed the question plainly, whether anyone in that church had ever in their life seen the Fort Benton District Office issue a 6-digit filing number before the year 1870. Nobody had. Pruitt tried to talk over her, dismissed the whole matter as a misunderstanding of complicated territorial paperwork, and it was in the middle of that bluster that Josiah Reed stood up from the back pew, drew the badge from where he had carried it hidden all these weeks, and made plain to the room who he was and what the Helena Marshal's office had already confirmed by wire that afternoon. That Continental Land and Title had run this same forged scheme in 2 other counties, and that warrants for Horace Pruitt and Vernon Coyle were already signed. Coyle was found and held before midnight, trying to leave the valley by the North Trail. Pruitt did not run far either, and by the time the territorial marshals rode in from Fort Benton 3 days later to take the pair of them east for trial, every ranch along Cutbank Creek had its rightful deed back in hand, the Hargroves' land restored along with everyone else's, and the whole valley had learned exactly which of its neighbors had saved it. They were married the following spring, in that same small church, with Amos Whitfield standing up for Josiah, since the man had no family of his own left living, and Mrs. Odell from the Piney Fork boarding house crying openly through the whole ceremony, despite having sworn beforehand she would do no such thing. Josiah requested a transfer from Helena to the territorial marshal's post nearest Piney Fork, close enough to ride home most evenings, and Split Rock grew that first year into something neither of them had quite pictured alone. The Hargrove children came twice a week for lessons at Rowan's kitchen table the way half the valley's children always had, and the Sorensen widows 3 found their own way there soon after, until the table stopped being big enough and Josiah built a proper schoolroom onto the side of the barn. 2 on the very spot where he had once lain healing under a stranger's careful hands with nothing but straw and a borrowed name to his account. It filled most mornings with more children than either of them could always keep track of, which suited a house that had spent 4 long years far too quiet, and Rowan found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the accounting she had always kept in her head, what decent people owed each other, paid whether or not it was ever paid back, had somehow arranged itself without her ever plotting it out, into a whole family she had not known to ask for. The valley that had once labeled Rowan Keller unmarriageable came to tell the story differently in the years after, the way valleys generally do once the ending turns out better than the gossip predicted, and there were folks who swore, with entirely straight faces, that they had always known she was too fine a woman for that talk to stick. Rowan let them say it. She had learned that grace was mostly the quiet art of letting people become kinder than they used to be without asking them to apologize out loud for who they'd been before, and besides, she had a schoolroom full of children and a husband who still, most evenings, found some small, honest reason to linger in the barn a while longer than the chores required, just to be near her. If a story like theirs is the kind that settles you in and keeps you there until the very last mile of road, there are a good many more waiting for you, carried complete from the first hoofbeat to the last, over on Cowgirl Chronicles. Pull up a chair by the fire. I'll leave the gate open for the next one.